Okay, class, we're about to start section 9.4 using the square root property to solve quadratic equations. We already know one way to solve a quadratic equation. We factor and solve, which we will demonstrate here. Okay, we have x squared minus 16 equals 0. We know that's the difference of two squares, so we will add x minus 4 and x plus 4 set equal to 0. So then we would set both of these parentheses equal to 0. And then solve. We would add 4 on both sides here. This is x is 4. We will subtract 4 on both sides here. And x is negative 4. So our final answer is x equals negative 4, comma 4. Now remember, you do not put this in parentheses because we don't want that to be an ordered pair. Now we go down here. It says solving a quadratic equation with the square root method. Isolate the perfect square on one side of the equation. Be sure the other side of the equation has only a number, no variables. Take the square root of both sides, include both the positive and negative square roots, and solve for the variable and simplify the answer. So we would take this same equation we had before, but this time we're going to add 16 on both sides. So we will add x squared equals 16. Now we will have to take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x squared is x, and it equals, the square root of 16 is positive and negative 4. So now when you write your final answer, it'll be x equals negative 4, positive 4. Now either one of these is acceptable. And if you notice, we got the same answer as we did in the first problem. Now the square root property. Let k be a non-negative constant. Then x squared equals k has two solutions. It'll be positive and negative k, or you could write it as k comma negative k. Now we want to solve x squared equals 9. So what we would do is, actually it's supposed to be positive or negative square root k. And then it'll be the square root of k and the negative square root of k. Well, let me erase this and rewrite this properly. This would be the square plus or minus the square root of k, or you could write it as the square root of k, comma negative square root of k. Okay, now we will apply this to example 1. It says solve x squared equals 9. So what we would do is this here. We would take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x, and it equals to the square root of 9 is a positive and negative 3. And that is your final answer. Warning, the equation x squared equals 9 has two solutions. We know it's 3 and negative 3. Recall that the square root of 9 is the one number. We know it's 3, or we could write positive and negative 3. Oh, actually, no. It's supposed to just be 3 here because this isn't part of an equation. The only time you get the two solutions as stated here is when it's part of an equation. So when you just have square root of 9 by itself, it'll just be the positive of that number. So now we look here at A. We got x squared equals 7. So we would take the square root of x squared and the square root of 7. Square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 7 is positive and negative square root 7. Now we come to B. We would have to add 50 on both sides. And we would add r squared equals 50. Now we would take the square root of both sides. And we would have r is equal to plus or minus. Now we know the square root of 50 has perfect squares in it. So it'll be the square root of 25 and the square root of 2. Now we know the square root of 25 is 5, square root of 2. So our final answer would be r is equal to positive or negative 5 square root 2. Now we come down here to example 3. Now remember, we must get the perfect square by itself. So we would subtract 5 on both sides. And we'll have 3x squared equals 75. divide each side by 3, and x squared equals 25. Now we would take the square root of both sides, and x is equal to positive and negative 5. Now we come here to D. Now if you notice, this whole parenthesis is squared, and nothing else is on this side except for the parenthesis squared, and is equal to a number. So we would take the square root of this parenthesis squared and the square root of 49. Now, the square root of this parenthesis squared will leave what's inside the parenthesis. And the square root of 49 will be positive and negative 7. Now we have to get x by itself. So we will add 1 on both sides. We have 2x is equal to 1 plus or minus 7. Then we will divide each side by 2. And we will have x equals 1 plus or minus 7 all over 2. Now we cannot leave our answer like this, because we know we would end up with a numerical value. So we could write our answer here. We will have x is equal to, it'll be 1 plus 7 over 2, comma 1 minus 7 over 2. Now we know that 1 plus 7 is 8, and divided by 2 is 4. So we will have 4 as our first answer. 1 minus 7 is negative 6, divided by 2 is negative 3. So this will be our final answer for that problem. Now we go here. It says solve the following using the square root method. Now we will divide each side by 8. And we will have n squared is equal to 3 over 8. Now we have to take the square root of both sides. And remember, this square root will be over this whole fraction. The square root of n squared is n, and is equal to plus or minus. Now we will break this up. This will be the square root of 3 over the square root of 8. Now we know that the square root of 8 can be broken down to the square root of 4 and the square root of 2. Now, the square root of 4 we know is 2. So, we will have n is equal to plus or minus the square root of 3 all over 2 square root 2. Now, we have to get rid of this square root of 2 out of our denominator. So, we multiply our numerator and denominator by the square root of 2. So in our numerator, we will have n is equal to plus or minus. We will have square root of 6 in our numerator. Now our denominator, we know the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 4, which we know is 2, times 2 is 4. So this would be our final answer. Now we come here to b. Now b is the same thing. We have to add 8 on both sides. So we add 2 times the parenthesis x plus 3 squared is equal to 108. Now we would divide each side by 2. And we add x plus 3 in parentheses squared is equal to 108 divided by 2 is 54. And then we would take the square root of both sides. So we would add x plus 3 on the left. The square root of 54, we know is not a perfect square, so we will have plus or minus, but we do have a perfect square in 54. We have a perfect square of 9, so we will add the square root of 9 times the square root of 6. So we will add x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus, the square root of 9 is 3, square root 6. Now we have to subtract 3 on both sides. And our final answer would be x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus 3 square root 6. And this is our final answer. Now we come down here to C and D. Now with C here, the first thing we will do is divide each side by 9. And we will have x minus 2/3 in parentheses squared is equal to 8/9. Now, we will have to take the square root of both sides. The square root of this side here and the square root of this whole fraction. So we will have x minus 2/3 is equal to, this would give us the square root of 8 over the square root of 9. Now we will have x minus 2/3 is equal to, actually this is supposed to be plus or minus as well. So it'll be plus or minus. Now the square root of 8, we've been doing that in previous problems. We know that that's going to give us 2 square root 2. And the square root of 9 is 3. So now we have to add 2/3 on both sides. So we will have x is equal to 2/3 plus or minus 2 square root 2 over 3. Now if you notice, they have the same denominator. So we know we would keep the denominator the same and combine the numerator. It would be 2 plus or minus 2 square root 2. And that is the final answer of this problem. Now we have to scroll back up here to D. Now if you notice here, we have a parenthesis squared, so we would do like we did in the other problems, where we just had a parenthesis squared. We would take the square root of both sides, and we will have bx minus d is equal to plus or minus the square root of k. Now, according to this here, typically we solve for x, so we're just going to solve for x here. So we will add d to both sides, and we will have bx is equal to d plus or minus the square root of k. Now we will divide each side by b, and we will have x is equal to d plus or minus the square root of k all over b. And this will be your final answer. Now, we scroll down here to the next set of problems. It says the poverty threshold in dollars for an individual under 65 years old in the U.S. at T years since 1900 can be modeled by this equation here. It says find P of 95. What does this mean in this situation? Now, first of all, to take care of that, it would mean, let's take care of the meaning. It would mean that whatever our answer is in 1995. So we took care of that. What does it mean? So what we need to know is what happens when we substitute in 95. So we could do this here. We could do this up here. It'll be P of 95 is equal to 4.95 times the parenthesis 95 minus 57 squared plus 1,406. Now, we have 4.95. 95 minus 57 will give 38, and that's squared plus 1,406. Now, we need to put this in a calculator. So I'm just going to pull up this calculator here. We have 4.95 times 38 to the second power, and then plus 1,406. So it'll be 8,553.8. So what does it mean in this situation? So that'll mean that, let's see. First of all, the answer would be $8,553.80. Now this is the poverty threshold. $8,553.80 is, let me change this. Is the poverty threshold in 1995. And that is the final answer. It says find T when P of T is 3,000 by hand using the square root method. What does it mean in this situation? So, okay class, I took the liberty of writing this out. So I will go over this step by step. We have P of T, equal to the formula. But we're told that P of T is 3,000, so we will substitute in 3,000 for the P of T. Then we would need to subtract 1,406 on both sides, which would give us 1,594. And then we would divide each side by 4.95. Now we will round this. This would give us 322.02. and would leave us t minus 57 squared. We would take the square root of both sides, and that would leave us plus or minus 17.94.